Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Values and Interests podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Maloney, Chief Public Affairs Officer at Carnegie Council. So, before we get into today's episode, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge the strikes by the US on Iran that started on February 28th. I think it's important context to note that this episode was in fact recorded a week prior to the start of the US operation. However, this interview and our guest today, I feel very deeply, could not be more apt and important for this moment. So I hope you learn as much as I did from our guest, Matias Spektor, professor and dean at the FGV School of International Relations in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Matias is a prolific writer and researcher on questions of geopolitics, power, and especially that relationship from a global South perspective. And with that, let's get right into the episode.
A moralism depletes the resources that others have to try and hold power accountable. That's a big change, I think, in the way America behaves and others are or are not able to respond.
Matias, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. So as we do on the Values and Interests podcast, again, the framework at Carnegie Council is that we don't like to bifurcate or separate kind of the values aspect from the political or the research aspect. So I wanted to start by kind of giving our listeners a sense of who you are as a person, your formation from a values perspective, and maybe some background on your career, and then we can kind of get into the meat of the geopolitical moment.
So I trained in political science and IR as an undergraduate in the 1990s. I studied at the University of Brasilia, which at the time was the only school in the whole of Brazil where you could take a degree in international relations. And values-wise, that school was very much a school that has now become all the rage, and it's in the fashion in the global north, which is the School of Strategic Autonomy. Mm-hmm. The idea that was prevalent in Brazil already then, at the height of the unipolar moment, that there was real danger in globalization, first of all, and there was even more danger in a world out of balance, that having a single great power was bound to breed disaster, because in the face of unchecked power, what you have is the great power playing havoc with the rules and institutions of the system, even if that power is the one that built it in the first place, that built that system in the first place. So that's the school I came out of. And then for my graduate work, I moved to Oxford in the United Kingdom, and I studied with a generation of scholars who'd been themselves students of Hedley Bull and the English school, the idea that there is an international society. And of course, my second year as a PhD student, that's when we had the Iraq War. And at the time in Oxford, of course, the big tension was that, if you remember, George W. Bush was the US president who claimed, and I think it's a direct quote, "There are no rules after 9/11. So I come from a school in Brazil and then a school in Britain that was always extremely cautious and suspicious of unchecked power in general and US unchecked power in particular, and schools that always saw US foreign policy not under the prism that is so common in the US-centered conversation about world politics, which is, the United States being the chief operator of the international order of our day is a status quo power, and there are these other challengers who are revisionists. and they may be the Soviet Union, or they may be the Irans of the world or the Chinas of the world, rather coming from a position that sees US power as deeply, deeply revolutionary in the form of, Bob Kagan kind of world. So
Yep.
that's my intellectual upbringing, if you want.
Yep. Yeah, yeah. No, very interesting. So I think that sets up kind of the conversation well today. And what I really want to do is think about this moment of transition. And people talk about this in a hyperbolic way, but now everybody's talking about it post Davos and post Munich Security Conference. So I think we'll just lean into that. But there is something happening in terms of the cycle of international relations and geopolitics. And so sitting in Sao Paulo, sitting in a G20 country, sitting in a country that's had its swing back and forth from right to left governments recently. Let's flip the script in terms of not looking at this from a US centric perspective, but looking at it from a global South perspective. And so, how are you seeing from Brazil right now, kind of the state of things, the disorder or order out there in the world right now?
So I guess the first thing one should note is that for the majority of observers in the part of the world I come from, the big transition that we're witnessing is a transition away from unipolarity into what most people at this end of the world believe to be an increasingly multipolar system. I know there's a big debate. I mean, if you open the pages of Foreign Affairs magazine, you will see the majority of commentary saying, well, we're not sure this is multipolar. This is unipolar
Yeah.
still, militarily at least, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's fair to say that from where I stand, the world looks as if US relative power has declined, has been declining, and is currently under Trump declining faster as power shifts away not only towards China, but also moves away from the nation state increasingly. And private actors are all the rage, and all sorts of governance models beyond the state are so prominent, creating deep trouble in an age where, coping with transnational problems has been a massive challenge, partly because the traditional multilateral institutions have a hard time providing the collective solutions that they were designed to provide.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of big transition that we're seeing. And of course, the other thing is the specific shock of Trump, the
Yeah.
new, not only the new style in diplomacy, which is so different from a lot of what we've seen coming from the United States, although not entirely, and we can go into
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
in a minute. Um, but also the deep impact that the world is suffering now from great power competition. The
Yeah.
idea that all the institutions we grew up with are now questioned, that their future is uncertain, that it's so hard for anybody now to imagine what world order will look like 10 years from now,
Yeah.
because we are at this turbulent time where so many crises coincide, and there seems to be no single power that can lay down the law and
Yeah.
establish a pattern of institutions and norms to
Yeah.
regulate things.
Yeah. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit in terms of kind of changing moment and outside of kind of the quote unquote great powers, right? Like, what does this moment mean? Especially the decay of those institutions, the principles, the rules that you talked about. So, this was early on last year. So, early on in Trump 2.0, on the podcast, I was speaking to Ambassador Ali Nasir Mohammed, who is the ambassador from the Maldives to the UN. And he talked about this, especially from a small island developing states perspective and from a Maldives perspective, this tension, right, in terms of simultaneously understanding, and you see the effects of climate change, the impact of some countries not playing by the same rules as others, but then making the statement that the Maldives survives security-wise, economically, because of the international system. So there is this tension there. And you talk about this kind of tension in terms of wanting to change the system, but also having protections under that system. And so maybe we can kind of get into the nuance around that, because I do think that is a space, at least in the policy, the politics world. We're seeing it a lot in the IR debate world, but in the policy world, that's not really a nuanced conversation a lot of people are having right now.
Sure, absolutely. So what we can say, I guess, is this. After the end of the Second World War, when the institutions and norms that we grew up with were created, so the United Nations, Bretton Woods, NATO, et cetera, when these institutions were created, these were mostly institutions built by what we now call the global north. And sometimes in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a coalition formed of post-colonial countries that became a fixture in multilateral institutions. They became a coalition, they had a joint project, and it was all about national autonomy, sovereignty, the principle of non-intervention, so on and so forth. So for decades now, countries outside the North Atlantic have been demanding changes to the system. But it's very imprecise to suggest that these have been countries with a revolutionary agenda. They are far more moderate reformists because they're so dependent on the system, because by and large, they benefited enormously from many of the features of the system. My own country, Brazil, was a rural economy in the 1950s. It had lots and lots of problems regarding development, regarding diplomatic activism and the ability to shape norms and rules. And when you compare that to what we have today, there is no aspect of Brazil's international life, be it in the economic realm, in the security realm, that is not deeply intertwined with the norms and institutions that were created after the Second World War. So yeah. Brazil has a deep stake in the survival of the system, and it has a deep stake in major powers being constrained by international law and institutions. So yeah. Do these countries want to change the norms and institutions? Yes, but to what effect? Not to get rid of them, but to improve the space these institutions and norms provide for these countries to flourish rather than chuck them away.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's you kind of alluded to this pragmatism that was there in terms of, although it was global north dominated, basically you look at even the number of UN member states, right? This gets increasingly larger as decolonialization happens to an extent, right? And so for me, I've been thinking a lot about this kind of missing good faith pragmatic space. And kind of on one end of the spectrum, I'm thinking about this massive short-termism in terms of politics right now, where it's like win the information ecosystem of the next hour. And then you have this long-termism in terms of tech companies and people that, are not really invested in a pluralistic system long term. They're invested in winning the future, right? Whether that be going to Mars or making sure there's a robot in everybody's house or fill in the blanks. And so one of the lines that kind of jumped out to me in a recent piece that you wrote for the New York Times was talking about kind of state sovereignty from a global South perspective as this like hard won thing, right? There is still proximity to that, to winning of that, right? And so moving forward, how is the global South kind of conceptualizing sovereignty or its own security in this environment, as you said before, with new actors who aren't necessarily thinking this international system is what's going to be around in 5 years, let alone next year?
That's a great question. So if you look at the evolution of the norm of sovereignty across the global South, what you will find is that the vast majority of countries have a very live memory of what it was when these countries were either colonies or had been very recently been colonies, if not formally, informally. So the idea that you can actually manage to secure autonomy in the way you do policy making in your capital city has become a quest for the majority of these countries. Another idea that comes up very prominently is the notion that for you to let go of sovereignty, you really need to have a very strong state. It's not any country that can let go of monetary policy and decide to set up a European central bank. You need to be a Germany, you need to be a France in order to do it. You cannot expect relatively weak countries or countries that only yesterday felt they were at the receiving end of a neo-colonial imposition to do that. And now one of the tragedies of the current day is that concerns with sovereignty have become dominant once again among big powers. The United States has a concern with sovereignty. You could run a presidential campaign that is successful on the idea that you need to win back control, that you will not let international institutions shape your policy-making process. If you go to Europe, the same. It's the era of strategic autonomy from de Gaulle is now back. And you hear it in the voice of the German chancellor, let alone, the Putins and the Xi Jinpings, where these ideas have been prominent for a very long time. So we are back to a world of hard power, sovereigntist, deep uncertainty and suspicion of international institutions. But the tragedy, Kevin, is, of course, that as scholars have shown time and again, it's so difficult to produce collective security if you do not have institutions that can reduce the costs of cooperation.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that as we move to a world that is highly competitive geopolitically, where there's so little trust, even among allies, the danger is that these institutions decline, and with them, our collective capacity to act. And as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world fails to pull together, then, that breeds trouble.
Yep. Yeah, so from a Carnegie Council perspective, we think about multilateralism or international cooperation as a political principle, but also a moral principle. And so you've talked a bit about this in your recent writings, especially around the turn from, I would say, values-based engagements or reciprocity through diplomacy to transactionalism. And I was wondering if you could talk about how you kind of, I guess, look under the car hood on something from a diplomatic or security perspective on building something around transactionalism versus kind of the system that we might have had that might have been a mix of interests and values based previously.
So traditionally, the United States, and to a large extent Europe after the Second World War, have used the language of the provision of global public goods, right?
Mm,
The idea that a lot of what they do is, of course, centered on self-interest, but at the same time, a lot of what they do is about managing the world, providing for others, securing the structures of a international order. And that language has been honored and abused at different moments in time. Transactionalism is not new, is not privy to Trump alone. We've seen transactionalism in the way the United States has operated all the way back. We can go back to inception with FDR, right? So that is not new. What is new is that at least from FDR onwards, but certainly before FDR as well, America couched its foreign policy in a language not only of interest, but of values that attended to the interest of other. The idea that this is a hegemon, but it is a hegemon that it's easy to join because it provides an awful lot for the rest of the world.
Mm.
And it holds certain values that are universal.
Yeah.
And that's the Declaration of Independence. And it's been repeated by almost every president since.
Yep.
Outsiders could look at this and say, well, what a source of inspiration. And America has provided a powerful source of inspiration for revolutionary movements, independence movements, progressives around the globe for more than 200 years now. But at the same time, outsiders could look at it and say, my goodness, what hypocrisy. Because oftentimes there's a disconnect between what America says and what America does. Better alternatives were available that America chose not to follow. And America retains this language of moral superiority. So there's an element of deception that makes outsiders squirm at the language of US foreign policy. That had been the norm. The new thing now with Trump is that he doesn't couch US power in the language of moral superiority. He doesn't claim that America does what he does in the altar of principles that are morally superior. And therefore, the others should accept American authority because, after all, America is such a benign hegemon. He's got none of that. He is far more amoral in the way he speaks. And this creates all sorts of dynamics that are new. The first one is that it's very hard to hold his feet to the fire. It's easier to criticize George W. Bush for the use of torture in Abu Ghraib because the argument for going into Iraq in the first place was an argument about freedom and security. With Trump, there's none of that. So what do you hold him to? And being unable to hold him to is not something that only happens to outsiders. It happens to the opposition party inside the United States. It happens to committees in the US Congress. It happens to the US media. Amoralism depletes the resources that others have to try and hold power accountable. And that's a big change, I think, in the way America behaves and others are or are not able to respond.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've hit on, there's a lot there. At the council, and listeners will have heard me talk about this, we think about this normative spectrum of post-World War II US foreign policy, of the spectrum between liberal idealism and amoral realism. And from an optimization standpoint, it's manifest as maybe a president or a Congress that would be pragmatically idealist, right? You think about the North Star and trying to strive towards that. I think there's another layer to the Trump transactionalism, and you kind of compare that to FDR, and there's a lot of nuance there. I would say that the difference is the type of transactionalism, in that there is a direct benefit to Trump and the people around him now. So it's not just a transactionalism from a state to state perspective, right? This is very much the norm has shifted within the Oval Office in terms of who is benefiting. And there's not even a real attempt to hide it. There's not a good faith attempt to hide it. And it's not even something that, we invested in this and it's coming out 5 years from now, or Dick Cheney was on a board, or President Obama was invested in X. Like, it's almost like real time happening day in and day out. So it's definitely I'm going to say interesting moment in quotes there. But I maybe want to kind of turn a little bit to this line that you have in your in one of your recent pieces, where you say the disappearance of hypocrisy can be thought of or seen as progress. And so maybe I get to you to expand upon that and react to that line, which of course you drafted.
Right. So for a lot of folk outside the United States, Trump has been a bit of fresh air because he doesn't sound like a hypocrite. I'll give you an example. When President Biden took office, one of the big flagship initiatives was the Summit of Democracies.
Yeah.
But at the same time that America was sponsoring a Summit of Democracies, President Biden was traveling to Riyadh and being chums with MBS. So for many people, that smacks as something odd. And the fact that then we had the Israel-Gaza tragedy happening,
Yep.
that awoke in people a sense that double standards, well, were the norm, because all of a sudden you had officials, both from the United States and the European Union, chiding the global South for not being tough enough on Putin, even if Putin was massacring, killing lots of civilians in the Ukraine, and yet not one word about civilians in Gaza being killed in the overt violation of international norms. So when Trump comes to office and talks as he does, many people reacted by saying, well, at very long last, the America that you see is the America that you get. No surprises there. He's not being deceitful, he's being truthful. We may not like what we see, but what we see at long last is what we get.
Yep.
Rather than this duplicitous, conniving attitude where I impose my fist of iron, but I cloak it in a silk glove. I don't agree with that view. I worry enormously about that view, precisely because of what I was saying in response to your last point, which is when you're able to call on someone for applying double standards, saying one thing, doing another, you have leverage right there to demand that they do better. They may not do better, but at least you have a tool with which to try and constrain them. The minute that goes, you've got nothing, because we're in a world of coercive diplomacy alone. And that is a despairing world for countries that don't stand a chance in a world where it's coercive diplomacy that gets you places.
One of the things that this year has, for people in the IR space or in the geopolitics space, this year has felt like a lifetime in terms of trying to keep up with the news. But I think one of the kind of deeply disturbing things of the past 10 days was this speech that Marco Rubio gave, and I want to get your reaction to it at the Munich Security Conference. And I took some days to reflect on it. And he, in comparison to the J.D. Vance speech, it was more palatable. It seemed a little more friendly on the surface. And everybody in the room stood and gave him a standing ovation. And as I got a few days away from this, the image kept coming to my mind of kind of almost starving people in a room and then throwing them a piece of bread and them getting up and kissing your feet or cheering for you. And it felt like the norm has been changed so much in terms of what Europeans expect or need from the US. And it was just this moment where I couldn't square that circle. And really underpinning it for me was this deeply disturbing narrative around different civilizations having different values or different value, right? They're literally like kind of ranking civilizations differently right now. And this goes to what you said before. There is this, at least there was this framework around the universality, the equal moral worth of every person. Yes, we might have tripped and had bad faith actors, and there's so many examples, but at least that was there as a thing, as an organizing thing. And now it seems it's just the blatant opposite. They're literally tiering how different societies are better than others. So sorry for the long windup, but this has been on my chest for about a week now. So I wanted to get your reaction to that and maybe how you viewed the security conference and the speech.
I agree with you, and I would go a step further to suggest that again, this is not entirely new. go back with me in time. If you remember when Obama first appeared in the national scene and it looked like he might have a chance to win the presidency, the rest of the world had a big sigh of relief because the world had grown accustomed to the war on terror that had been applied in ways that had violated international law, that had produced a massive disaster both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. When you had officials in and around the White House publicly defending the use of torture in the land of the free, and when you had racial profiling going nuts, the discrimination not only about the people of Islamic faith, but the Arab world in general, and even Arab American communities. And all of a sudden, Obama, who spoke in terms of universal values, captured the imagination of the rest of the world. Obama had won the presidency outside the United States way before he won it inside. And you will remember the crowds that came to see him in Berlin as he was campaigning. And my goodness, the man won a Peace Nobel Prize soon after taking office and before having secured any meaningful peace. So this is not the first time that we see a president of the United States that tends to ignore international law, international norms, that is America first, and that is willing to, do all sorts of compromises to the horror of audiences outside the United States. And therefore, when these people hear something different, they rally, and it makes a big difference. We can go further back in time. I think one of the most interesting exercises is the story of President Reagan. President Reagan is seen, by and large, inside the United States as a beacon of freedom and prosperity in the world, the man who fought the Cold War and won it, and who expanded liberty to Eastern Europe. Yes, but President Reagan is also the man who used the force, certainly in the Caribbean, in my part of the world, but also in the Middle East, in ways that are highly questionable, that involve lots of accusations of corruption, of course, but also someone who was willing to support dictators as long as they were friendly dictators. And not only support them, but actually empower them. The Kirkpatrick Doctrine, the author of the Kirkpatrick Doctrine was President Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations. So this is not the first time. We've been in a place that is similar before. Of course, it's not the same, but this is not entirely new. And my guess is that these two will pass, and the time will come when there will be a president of the United States that will restore the language of universal values moving forward. Or so one hopes. I don't know.
I think that, again, from a US perspective, right now it feels there's the way I added a layer of transactionalism. I'm going to posit another layer here in that I completely agree with what you said. I think a big point of difference from a US perspective right now is that whether it was Bush or Reagan or Nixon, whether it's Watergate or Abu Ghraib or Iran-Contra, there was still that thing that allowed them to be checked and pay a political price. The norms around that are shifting so quickly in the US right now that will that price still get to be paid, or will they still have to pay that price? And this is the big question in terms of a pluralistic versus anti-pluralistic future. I think the midterms are going to be a big point as kind of a marker for that moving forward. But again, we talked about kind of the you don't know what you have till it's gone from an international perspective, albeit flawed. If this was what some presidents were willing to do with significant checks from an institutional perspective, what does that look like with hard power capabilities, with technology, with economic capabilities unchecked? And that's a very scary scenario for me. And I think it's a fork in the road coming up. And this could just be the beginning of kind of a much darker trail. And I know that we're thinking about this a lot at the council, so I wanted to get your reaction to that.
I'm so glad you bring this up, Kevin, because I entirely agree. There's the American political system is so distinctive and it has this peculiar design of checks and balances that largely determine the extent to which whoever is in the Oval Office can or cannot do certain things abroad. So for audiences outside the United States, whether there are checks in place makes a hell of a difference. And the one thing that I think mystifies most observers of the United States outside, including myself, is the fact that unlike it was the case with Nixon, with Reagan, with George W. Bush, for some reason, the way the US political system has evolved is such that there seems to be the case that whatever checks operate on the current president, these are at the level of mass publics and mass public opinion. And it will be voters in the poll who will exercise some constraint. It's mystifying for outsiders what's happening with the Democratic Party, what's happening with the Republican Party machine, and what's happening with the Supreme Court. And this, for the first time in my adult life, has opened the question, which I never thought I would ever encounter as a younger training political scientist. Is America functioning democracy? Is authoritarianism creeping in the body politic of the United States? I have a hard time remembering a point in time in which I thought this was a real threat. And yet here we are, and these are the terms of the conversation. That resolution that is US domestic politics will have so many ripple effects across the world that I entirely agree. This is to a large degree what the future depends on, which fork on the road we're going to take.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this is the really difficult question of thinking about these things in practice, is that there is, inherently ethical value. I'm talking from the frameworks of the council here, in making sure that international systems are as equitable as possible, right? And we think about that as maximizing the universality and basically human security within that and flourishing within that. But we're not divorced from an understanding of power. And so a lot of what we think about is this Hans Morgenthau relationship between values and power, right? And what does power mean within democracies? How can it be tempered? How can it be shaped? But it has to start at power. And I think whether or not we're seeing kind of the decay of the international law at this moment, it's not because the laws haven't changed necessarily. It's because powers aren't underwriting them as they used to. They're not prioritizing them as they used to. So I think there's this constant tension around wanting to be more equitable, but also accepting the power realities of the moment. And I think we've seen the speed at which not paying attention to the power realities, whether politically or geopolitically, if there's one person at the helm who's given all the power, climate change regulations in the US gone, right? Regulation of AI companies gone, right? It's just so I'm not saying that as eloquently as I should, but I think there's this tension there that people want to go in a positive direction or have kind of the same moral political North Star, but a lot of time there's tension between this power and this values dynamic. And be it geopolitically as in multilateral institutions or even domestically in the US.
Yeah, that's great. Let me respond to it, bringing up the following. In a world of unchecked power, the guy at the helm can lay down the law on the others. And that can be terrible for the others, but the guy at the helm could be inspired by universal values, believe in certain principles that help shape a world that is not a world of pure hierarchical imposition, right? The problem is that now, and this compounds everything we've said, the problem is that now power is far more checkered. And even if there was a president of the United States who wanted to expand the range of norms and institutions that provide global governance, this person would have a far harder time to lay down the law, to write the new rules for the road than, say, George W. Bush could after 9/11, or that Reagan could in the long 1980s. Because now American power is checked in ways that we haven't seen for a long time. Of course, you will get the counter argument to that saying, well, militarily, America still is number one. And can't you see what we saw with Maduro in Venezuela and what's likely to happen these coming days in Iran and so on and so forth? But if you look not only at China and Russia doing what they can to puncture US hegemony in the South China Sea and in Eastern Europe, respectively, but you also look at the way countries in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East now deal with different expressions of US power. Look at the condemnation of Israel for genocide in the ICJ. Look at responses to the new wave, the war on drugs, and you will see that it's far more difficult for America under Trump or under any other president to be the chief designer, architect, and operator of international order. And the fact is that we have not been in a system with more than two great powers for 80 years, and we kind of forgot. And the scant memories we have are not happy ones. We go back to the 1930s. We go back to the 1910s. These are the prequels to Great Power War. We have to go all the way back to the 19th century to remember what it was to be in a multipolar system where the major powers were not in constant war against one another. And even then, the amount of violence in the international system was enormous compared to what we've grown accustomed to in the age of bipolarity in the Cold War and the age of unipolarity post 1989.
I wanted to maybe close the conversation in terms of, I think so often, the narratives that are being fed are, again, are so US centric or so European centric. So, you're sitting at this amazing university in Brazil, and you're really thinking about these global order questions. For my audience, where should we be going to kind of read and to get information from really a global South perspective about kind of this moment of international transition? And this is for my own personal selfish reasons as well, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on resources there.
Well, I'll tell you what, when I got the invitation to come onto this podcast, the first thing I did was click on who you'd interviewed in the past, and I was taken aback because I'm used to going into any of these type of podcasts and seeing, the usual suspects from a bunch of, say, 10 universities around the global north exclusively. And your podcast is truly, genuinely global. And immediately I made up my mind and said, of course I want to be there. So what I would encourage people is to try and remember these basic principle of international politics, which is what you see very much depends on where you sit. The idea that China is a threat is a dominant idea in many parts of the world, but it's not a dominant idea in many other parts of the world. The idea that Putin is an authoritarian killer of civilians who will stop at nothing after he expands the range of his borders to recreate the Soviet Empire is a dominant idea in some parts of the world, but it's not at all the dominant idea in other parts of the world, where Putin is seen as someone who's managed to use force to deny US hegemony in Eastern Europe, and that is a source of stability, not instability. I know it sounds odd, but you find those kinds of arguments in some places. So I would encourage people to try and listen to as many different arguments as they can. And that means, of course, attending to sources that are not obvious. And to the degree that's possible, try to widen the range of messages they listen to. I certainly try. But then, of course, in an integrated, globalized world, it's so hard to do. The barriers are so evident, language being one of them.
Yeah, I think it's a personal challenge to be comfortably uncomfortable. And then there's a bigger challenge, which is harder for the individual to sort through right now, which is understanding kind of the good faith versus bad faith sources of information, even if they have a political bent to them. And, the AI slop is coming. We're seeing the deep fakes of John Mearsheimer out on YouTube. And, it's an interesting moment again. But I fully agree with you. I think that the push to have oneself to do that from an information sort aligns with our pluralistic approach here at the council. So, Matias, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
To listen, learn, and reflect on the most critical issues at the intersection of ethics and international affairs, be sure to subscribe to Carnegie Council wherever you get your podcasts.